Alright, today I'm working on a sampler cooler that's not getting cold enough. So this is one of our customers' sites. This is their sewage plant. So basically they test all the sewage water and they have to test it before and after it gets filtered. So today I'm working on the influent, so the incoming water. And basically goes through a bunch of filters and whole chemical process. And this little cooler here, this crazy expensive cooler, has a little pump on top of it. And it takes samples and it puts it into a container. That water has to be cooled in order for the sample to be accurate. So this cooler here is sitting at room temperature. And there is no evaporator fan on this unit. It almost looks like a domestic style coil, evaporator coil. Alright, so the first thing I want to check is, we have a call for cooling. So using our visual checks, we can actually figure that out really quickly. So we come off of here, our hotline right off their plug. Come to our temp controller. Now if this is closed, we're going right to our condenser fan and to our overload on the compressor. We also need our neutral side. Okay, our neutral side is not going through the temp controller, it's just a straight shot to all our loads. So boom, condenser fan, and then to all our start components here. So my visual check here is going to be this condenser fan. If this condenser fan is running, I know that this switch is closed here. So as always, I'm trying to test the least amount of points, work in the quickest way possible, the most efficient way possible, and that's by studying the schematic. So I probably looked at this schematic for, I don't know, 30 seconds to figure out, okay, let's check the condenser fan. Alright, so our condenser looks pretty bad here, rusted out, but the fan is running. Alright, so our condenser fan is running. So based on that, we know the temp controller is closed. So now the next step is we're going to go check to see if we have amperage at this compressor. Okay, I'm going to take it off this red wire here, the common wire coming into the overload. Alright, our compressor does have amp draw here, 1.04 amps. So next thing to do is to gauge up. Alright, so unfortunately I only have an access port on the suction side. That should be good enough to just do our basic troubleshooting. I will tap in on the high side if I need to. So we have a cap tube here, so we're going to be a fixed suction pressure. So to figure that out, we look at our desired box temperature. So in this case, it's 34 Fahrenheit. And we're going to subtract the TD of the coil. So in this case, it's 20. And that's going to give us 14 Fahrenheit. So if we go to our PT chart, 14 Fahrenheit equals 14.4 PSI. So that is the pressure that we're going to be looking for once we gauge up. Alright, so we are running in a vacuum here. Alright, so we have 8 inches mercury. And we are looking for 14.4 psi. So that's telling me we're low on suction pressure. It would be nice to check the head pressure, but at this point I would have to tap in. So at this point I know either we have a low charge or restriction. So the easiest thing to do at this point is to just add some refrigerant to see if we're restricted or we're low on charge. Alright, so I've added the refrigerant in. I've added about half the charge. We're at 12 psi, so that tells me we're low on charge. We do not have a restriction. So next thing I'm going to do here is add in some nitrogen. So I'm at 119.8 psi. I'm going to do a quick leak test. I did do a leak test on the condensing unit. The video just came out pretty poorly there. I really thought that condenser was going to be leaking, but surprisingly it's holding. So I'm just going to sweep this coil. Like I said earlier, it's almost like a domestic style coil that you're seeing here. And if I don't find the leak here, I am going to pump the pressure up to the maximum that we can go according to the rating plate. So I'm not having any luck here so far. So I'm going to pull out the evaporator coil and get behind it and see if I can leak test from there. Let's test this whole line set and behind the coil. Now I have more access. If there is a little pinhole leak, we have a better odds of finding it at this point. Alright, so I'm picking something up on this suction return line. Yep, definitely right in there. And this is one of the ones where they fuse the cap tube to it. So sometimes when that happens, it'll leak when they braze that together. So yeah, this thing's leaking here on this joint. You can see the pressure's dropped. We've dropped about 1 psi in about, I don't know, we're under 10 minutes here. So I talked to the customer. They wanted a new coil. The new coil comes with the line set. This unit's very critical to them, so it was a no-brainer. I could have attempted to fix that line set, but I got a feeling it was leaking in that cap tube as well. Alright, so I've brazed in the new evaporator coil, the new filter dryer with the access port. So I'm going to use my Schrader tool here and torque everything in. If you don't have one of these, I highly recommend it. So you don't over tighten, or you don't tighten enough the Schrader. Usually it's the other way around, you're over tightening it. Alright, so we're just going to hit fast forward here. So all I'm doing here is pushing nitrogen through, and we're going to just wait and feel the pressure coming out. So I'm going to get up to as close as my operating range as possible. So 12 to 14 is what I'm looking for. I go above it. Now I'm at 30. If I wasn't feeling pressure there, I would be cranking this thing up like crazy. I have good flow. Audio's not super coming through on this one, but there's good flow there. So I'm looking for 12 to 14. That's when I really want to test the pressure. So we're at 12 now. We have good flow coming through there. So that tells me the cap tube's not restricted. And we should be good. So I'm just going to let the pressure drop down a little bit more, and then I'll just let the nitrogen come out through my gauges just to go a little bit quicker. Now if I was at 12 and I only had a little bit of flow, I know that there's an issue there. So I would have cranked it up. Alright, so now I'm going to add a trace amount of refrigerant so that we can do our leak test. I've brazed in the cap tube into the filter dryer. So I try to put in like 5 or 10 psi usually. It's all I really need for this leak detector to pick it up, and then obviously pump the rest in with the nitrogen. Alright, so we have the nitrogen in there now, 93.7 on the low side. 93.4.3 on the high side. I'm going to let it equalize for a bit. While that's happening, I'll use my leak detector here. We'll go sniff all the joints that I brazed, make sure nothing's leaking. We don't want to find out when we're doing the vacuum that we can't pull down to 500 microns because there's a small leak. So now's the time to be a little bit more thorough. I always spend a little bit of extra more time on the nitrogen check with the leak detection, just so you don't get burned later on in the process. So far so good, no leaks. But the true test is going to be looking at our pressures to see if they've dropped at all. So pressures have not dropped. It's been about 15 minutes. This thing's holding, there's no leaks. So I'm going to let the nitrogen out. I'm going to install the vacuum. I'm going to put on the cord tool remover. And we're going to run the vacuum with no Schraders in it and pull down to 500 microns. It's going to happen pretty quickly. So we're done the vacuum. I'm charging the unit here. The bottle's equalized. I have about half the charge in, so I'm going to have to fire up the unit in order to get the rest of the charge in. It's not taking any more. Alright, so we already determined what the suction pressure is going to be. We're looking for 14.4 psi within that range of a 12 to 14 Fahrenheit coil. Okay, so next we're going to figure out the head pressure. So that's pretty simple. We're just going to take the ambient temperature and we're going to add 30 Fahrenheit. So in this case, we're in and around 45 Fahrenheit. We're going to add 30 Fahrenheit. And that's going to give us 75 Fahrenheit. So based on a 75 Fahrenheit, we go to our PT chart. And that's telling us we're looking for 78.7. PSI, but what I'm going to be looking for is the ambient temperature plus 30, but I'm going to be looking at the condenser saturation temperature. Okay, I'm not going to focus on what the pressure is. It's more about the temperature than anything, and that just makes everything easier. Yeah, my meter's going to convert it, but I'm just focusing on the condenser saturation temperature. Alright, so I have the full charge in there. We're going to let the suction pressure come down. It won't take too long, and then we'll compare our pressures to what they should be. Make sure that our condenser TD is correct. So right now we're at 45, 46, and we're getting 76 condenser saturation. Suction pressure is taking some time to come down, but this room's pretty cold. So we have good suction now, and if you look at our condenser saturation, it's 77 Fahrenheit versus 44 Fahrenheit. And that puts our condenser split at about 33, which is really good. We're right in the range. So last thing left now is to cycle the unit. So condensing unit did shut off. We're at 35 Fahrenheit. We are all good here. Alright, so as you can see, we cycled off at the end. It's always cool working on these different refrigeration units that have different applications. So in this case, all their sewage water has to be tested. So it goes into this plant. There's a pump on top of that cooler, takes a sample, they test it once a day, and that sample has to be cooled. And then at the bottom there of that unit, there's another cooler. They have to take a sample there as well, coming in and coming out. And then just a second thing quickly, so the evaporator TD coil was 20 on this one. I know there was no fan. The only reason why I know that is because I've worked on this unit a lot, or these type of units quite a bit. So I always make sure I write down pressures. I've probably been doing that for more than 10 years. The reason for that is when I originally worked on this unit years ago, I didn't know what the TD was supposed to be until I repaired it. So just get in the habit of taking notes of your pressures on different units, like let's say the Subway Duke Rail coolers or the Randall coolers. that have funny pressures and just things that don't really make sense.